Welcome to the Family Pictures Podcast. I am Michael Branson Smith, and I'm here with the mega awesome
Jim Groom.
Jim Groom.
Kim Droom. Anyway.
Can we do like entrance music for you or something like that? What would your entrance song be if you had one? What would you choose?
Actually, I don't know if you're keeping score, any of you, 12 listeners out there. I think you all know at this point that Michael Branson Smith is the mega awesome one. I am just the sidekick and happy to be here.
Well, your entrance music would definitely be, something punk, and I'd hear the that's probably what it would be, or something according to that. But this is episode number 45, episode 3 of the Family Frontier series, and boy, are we doing a unique film. We are doing The New Land, which is by Swedish director. Oh gosh, what's his name? Because I don't even know these people.
Jan
Troell, and it's 1972, and this is a film that reminded me a lot of the book The Americans. You know The Americans, the photography book by Robert Frank?
I do know it, yes.
And so Robert Frank is this...
It's kind of like a 50s, almost like a beat photographer, right?
Totally. But what it is it's a foreign perspective of America, and that's what is important. So he's a Swiss photographer, and he gets a Guggenheim grant to basically take photographs across America. He takes his family with him too, which is really interesting. It's kind of like a road trip, like an Alice in City style road trip. And he shows us what America looks like from the outside. And I think that's what this film does so well, because we have this Swedish filmmaker. Now, it's based on these books, which is very important, because there's the writer Moberg, who has written Wilhelm Moberg. Yeah, he's written four books. This is like the Game of Thrones, like Fire and Ice series for Sweden or something about.
Well, he's like the Shakespeare of Sweden. Like this is like the epic, novel that every Swedish boy and girl will read through their high school. Like this is like, can I say it? Ground zero for Swedish literature in the 19th and 20th century. And so like, this is important, right? Like this, putting this on film for Swedish folks is important.
And to speak of that importance, he resisted its adaptation for years, and it wasn't until he had seen Troll's film "Here's Your Life," where he was so impressed with the storytelling that he reached out to Troll, asking him to do the adaptation. And interesting enough, he had not even read the books yet. And so he, of course, went about quickly to read them, and he's completely intimidated. Understandably, this is like an epic. And, what we're doing here in The New Land is we're actually doing the second film. The first film is The Immigrants. And The Immigrants is all about life in southern Sweden and how harsh it was, and how they're basically impossible life as farmers trying to till land that is filled with like rocks and just, the subsistence living, and then making the choice to leave. And it's interesting because in the research I was discovering, Troll talked about in this era, Sweden was so struggling, or Swedish people were struggling at such a rate that over 1 million Swedes moved out of the country, mostly to the United States, in the decades between like 1850 and 1920, to the tune of almost a quarter of the population of the country leaving, which is insane. Like that's insane.
It's like an Irish emigration, right? It's on par with that.
Yeah.
And the other thing too, and it was interesting because you recommended this film. I had never heard of this film, even though it had kind of been up for Best Picture in 72 and the year before that, international film. Never heard of it. Never heard of this director. I mean, it was mind-blowing. But so anyway, I go in to do my part of the research. I listen to the Liv Ullmann interview, which is amazing. Liv Ullmann, she's amazing. And I'm seeing all this footage of them on a boat, of them leaving their Swedish house. And I'm thinking to myself, like, did this get cut for the American version? Like, was there, am I not watching the right film? Because she's talking about the film and they're
Yeah, yeah.
getting all these shots. And I'm like, oh, wait, there's a whole nother 3 hour film to deal with the first part of this.
Yeah, and it is like it also like the Americans, the this photography book, which is like 83 photographs of a portrait of America, whittled down from literally over 10,000 photographs. Similarly, this is like a Herculean effort by Troll. He was not only this is a 6-hour film, if you will, that we're doing the second half of. He shot the entire thing. He was the cinematographer. And he also edited the thing. And this is analog editing. And this is something I was lucky enough to take part of when I was in getting my MFA, like literally cutting and splicing physical 16 millimeter film and using tape and putting together frames and strips and trying to track them is freaking impossible. The labeling systems alone of these spaghetti trails that go in these bins, and that's literally to this day in editing, like in Premiere, they call folders, where you organize media assets, they call them bins because that's what they're from. And I can't even imagine. And he and the second documentary, which I sent you to watch, which is an interview with Troll, he talks about editing that really experimental scene in the desert where Robert and Arvid are kind of losing it as they're dying of thirst, and there's this jump cutting back and forth between two shots, and that would be such painstaking work. This is something that last seconds would probably have taken him hours just to cut together, because he's literally physically cutting and taping this film together.
And Liv Ullmann in the interview with her was saying, like, Jean was always filming. So
Yeah,
he was one of those people who, no matter what the cast were doing, he'd walk around with a film, with a camera on his
yeah,
shoulder,
yeah,
filming. And so he had, like you said, so much footage to go
so
through,
much.
and
Yeah,
was really kind of, treating it. And the relationship between him and the actors seemed very congenial. And
yeah.
they loved working with him. And Liv Ullmann said this was by far her favorite film to be a part of. And
Mm.
she worked with the master Bergman. So, like, she's giving him great great kind of like kudos. But on top of that, she said, like, I never knew when we were filming for the film or not. Like, it was always being filmed, everything. And
Yeah,
so I can't imagine what he had to deal with.
right. Yeah, and so it's kind of a remarkable kind of document, this movie, and is this expression of labor, which is we're going to talk a lot about, because it is so in stark
Yeah.
contrast to the American Western, the classic American Western, two of which we've done, like Shane and the Searchers, which is all about the gunfighter, the vengeance seeker, the man that is going to protect through violence, the frontier family. And it's through the lens of the man that we see the frontier family. And this is a polar opposite story. Not only is it about a homemaker and the time, there's no drama that is presented dramatically. Everything is, oh, someone dies. Next scene. Oh, there's winter, there's spring, there's winter. And it's just kind of this elliptical going through time. And all we're seeing over and over and over is the labor of a wife, of a mother, the labor of a man trying to figure out like how he can afford to get his first ox, and
Yeah.
so he can produce twice as much. And it's just it's an astounding kind of phenomenon. And so one of the things I also discovered, I don't know if, because this was a late note I added, is that Moberg visited Minneapolis to research his book back in like 1948, and to this day, there's a house that's known as the Karl Oskar House, or the Naya Duvamala House, right?
Wow.
That sits about an hour northeast of Minneapolis, right on the Kichi Saga Park, and this is kind of a tourist attraction now. And it's this house that was built by the Carl Lynn family back in 1860s. In this house, you can tell there's this photograph. If you click on the link, you'd see it, that is literally the photograph that the film ends with, which is this portrait of an extended family from, decades and
Wow.
decades,
Yeah,
of
totally.
rearing and surviving the times. And they're all very well dressed. And there's 50 of them in this photograph. And this family apparently is a large inspiration. And the photo is like from 1904. So it's 5 decades later, from the moment they
I'm
had immigrated.
I mean, talk about like a perfect marriage of, what we're trying to go for with the family film. And, I really felt this one on some deep levels, as,
Yeah.
we both did when we talked before it. But there was also a stream of connection with, even though the Searchers and the Shane are just completely different animals from
Yeah.
America in the 50s, there was this kind of sense of domesticity and what it means to,
Right.
be domestic. And I
Mhm.
think this film actually takes that theme in these 50s westerns and drills in a realistic, very meditative, existential, if you will, way that no other western I've ever seen comes close to. Like, this is just a unique film. Again, it was a complete surprise. I put on this 3.5 freaking tome that you're like, yeah, we got to watch this week. I'm like, Jesus Christ, a Swedish film, 3.5 hours? What are you doing to me? But this was absolutely stunning,
Yeah.
and stunning also in just its ability to touch on a human level, that process of, you know the switch, into this idea of family and responsibility, especially for the parents, because that's who this is really about. And
Right.
like you said, what that family labor looks like in a completely hostile environment. And that is just a really brilliant combination of factors to make this film, I just think, one of the best films. I mean, I'm putting it up there. I used to have Bergman's Shame, which actually stars Max von Sydow and Liv Ullmann, in my top five. I think this film is kind of like of that. It is kind of a Bava Pantheon film now. I loved it. Anyway,
Oh, good. No, I mean it's just kind of remarkable. Like I love how we stumbled into this because this was not something I had known about, and I was doing research like frontier family films, and blah. This one pops up, and I'm like, "Ooh, this looks really interesting." But I did not realize this is like the anti-Western Western, right?
yeah,
You know,
totally.
as you described, like it is a very violent environment, but it's not dramatically presented. Like there's a blizzard scene that we're going to talk about that's like insane and inspires George Lucas. We imagine
Yeah,
in a
totally.
in a future scene, and it's not about triumph. It's about like just exhaustion. This is, I think, the thing. Like speaking of like connection, it's like we're both parents, and babies and raising little kids is just it's fucking exhausting,
Oh
and
my God.
it's slow. There are so many just hours just spent just being present in front of a child that's looking for attention in a way that a child doesn't recognize attention isn't necessary, but you're there because that's your job. And that's the whole point. It's just job. It's just labor. It's just what you do if you're going to succeed at raising a family. But in this film, the environment is so nasty and difficult, from the beginning. They're in this shanty, which is so wonderful. Like the film basically starts with them pulling their meager belongings onto this land that I've read the Wikipedia, and I can't wait to watch The Immigrants, because I'm gonna upload a copy of it so you can watch it too.
Yes.
um, that film ends with him discovering this plot, right? Like, the soil is perfect. It's rich. We will be able to produce here. And so the new land starts with them dragging their meager number of belongings on this cart with an oxen that they're borrowing because they don't have one, we learn later on. And it looks brutal just from the beginning, like just getting there,
It's
and she's bouncing around with the two, I
it's
think, or three children they already have. I can't remember how many they have. Like the
yeah,
count
they
of
had three
children
or
is
four
also,
already.
yeah, the
I
count of children is never enumerated at any moment, because that's one of the unique things about this, which is also reminds me of this kind of labor. It's like there is no portrait of family all together, right? You don't, they're never all gathered together. There's a couple moments where they're somewhat together, but they're always working, and they're always like, even the kids are just kind of scampering around trying to figure out, how do I do this, or how do I survive that?
I'm always waiting. I was waiting during this film always for like, what's going to happen to this kid? Are they going to fall in the lake? Are they going to get trodden by an oxen? Like, I was always petrified for the kids because it was literally like, every kid and person for themselves, as you imagine to some degree it would. But like, back to that opening scene, and it's a great place to start with this film. So I'm putting the film on, digging in, and like the Swedish Film Festival logo, or the Swedish film logo comes up, and then a second logo comes up, and then the beautiful shot of Minneapolis, or I imagine Minnesota, in the fall. And
It's
then,
actually this is almost all shot in Sweden, by the way, just so you know.
okay, so I guess the imagined Minnesota in the
Yeah.
fall coming down, and there's still zero sound. And it must be
No.
like a minute and change before you slightly hear that ox carriage move. And you get this amazing sense like they're on a boat, although she refers to, I never want to rock again,
Oh,
nor
yeah,
on a
right.
carriage or on a boat. And it's interesting because I don't have the Emigrants. I don't even know the Emigrants as a film. So I don't have any of that in my like imaginary yet. But I am so taken by the fact that we're finding them in media res as they're coming up. And this story works almost completely independent, I imagine, of the other film. And it's amazing. You got this, she's holding these kids, they're coming through. Max von Sydow or Carl Oscar is like, no, move, you.
Yeah.
And he's doing this weird, like, and moving them.
Yeah.
And immediately you're in this situation with
Yep.
this family.
Mhm.
And like, that you're on a ridiculous kind of oxen ride, if you will, to this crazy plot that then they talk about. But I love the way this opened. And whether or not there was an immigrants, I was so kind of taken by the way they didn't have to explain that backstory of the Swedish family for you to be completely in on what was happening and what they were doing. And, I had some sense of it because this was a Western film we were doing, and I knew we were talking about immigrants. But like, I just love this opening and love the whole way it starts you into the family life and them starting from the beginning, if you will.
Yeah, and and the and it's so great because when they show up on their property, Carl Oscar's so proud. He's like, "Look, we already have a shanty. It's this little teeny shack, and this is where they subsist and cooking on open fires, and it's so effing cold, and they're just endlessly. It's like, we got to clear the land, kneading bread, hauling water, like, going out into the frozen lake and, chopping through the ice to gather water. You have to
Yeah.
gather water, there's no taps, of course. And, and it's just the way that the film just has time pass, and, there are events that happen. But what I always go back to is it always returns to work. Each and every scene, whether it's like my favorite, that's like one of my favorite things is like he's they're running out of flour. And so he's like, well, hey, here's this jug, and it's like maple syrup that he's made, and it returns to showing him going back to tap more trees. And making maple syrup is some of the slowest like work you can imagine. It just doesn't happen fast at all. And to gather like a half a gallon of syrup is probably dozens of hours of work ultimately.
I mean, you nailed it right there for me. Like, there are scenes in that first half hour, 40 minutes of this film, and that is how slow this film is, because it's just establishing you, and it really takes you in where he's trying to, you know, get flour. And in order to do that, he deals with this American kind of like shopkeeper, general
Yeah, the
store owner.
general store operator. Yeah.
And
I love
the
him.
best part of it is Max von Sydow, who can speak English, in this
Yeah.
film can't. And
Yeah.
I relate to him so much given where I am in Italy. And like he's going there and he's like, go and trying to point out. And the guy's like, no, you need 20 cents. You don't have enough to get this. And then he brings up the maple syrup. But there's this also this sense of when he can do it financially. And ultimately, there's another part where he takes the postage. He's so happy and so proud, and
Yeah.
he kind of shakes his hand. But there's always not only the idea of labor, because what's on the other end of labor is obviously the money, and you get a sense that they're piss poor. They don't have anything but the clothes they came with, and like they're now trying to truly build like not an empire, just
Right.
a simple house. And the way it communicates that so quickly, but also the way you see Carl Oscar as well as um, uh, Katerina, is that the right way to say that, Katrina?
No, I think it's just Christina.
Christina, sorry. The
Yeah.
way you see them kind of deal with the finances, for
Oh
me,
yeah. Yeah, I love
really
that.
put me
There
in
was
that.
this early like kind of family finance discussion. And it's about a cow. It's like we need a cow. And he's like, I can't afford a cow. And it's like I
Can't get
can't imagine the kids going through the winter without milk. Like, how are we gonna go through the winter without
Will
milk?
they
And
survive the winter, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like the kids won't make it. And it is it's classic like stick to itiveness, if you will, that is presented again and again, like because a couple scenes later suddenly a cow is showing up and they're borrowing a cow from a neighbor and they're like, oh, we have two cows, you can borrow this one for the winter. And it's like, whoa.
You know what it also made me think of, Michael? It made me think of the fact like here they are in the middle of, the West. And as much as they have very different and far more extreme conditions, I completely related to Carl Oscar at that point. It's like going to bed and being like, okay, how am I going to pay that bill? How am I going to
Yeah,
pay this bill?
yeah.
I need to get heat going on. And that, I mean, we were
Mhm.
super tight when we moved to Fredericksburg, and Antonella being from Italy and we moved to Fredericksburg. It was basically like she was a little bit of like Christina, like, what the fuck? I want to go back to Italy. I don't want to be here.
I want
And
my family. Yeah.
yeah, and I do think that there was a real like while we were near not in any sense in the same situation as Christina and Carl Oscar, that real sense of if you're a parent and you've been in there looking at the
Mm.
abyss of like, how the hell are we going to do this? Like,
Yeah.
what is it going to take for us to, did I get it over my head when I had one, two, three kids? Yes. How am I going to do this? Right. And I really, throughout this movie, I was like, there are similar concerns, even though my concern is, maybe to Wells Fargo and some
Mm.
other fucking bank. Theirs was just to the local general shopkeeper or to the neighbor about the cow, but they seemed as insane and intense as
Yeah.
anyone's now.
Hmm. Yeah, there's this wonderful moment early. I got to find it. This quote. This is it, where there's these incredible long takes of them sometimes, like close-ups of their faces, like Carl Oscar and Christina talking, and often at night and in the darkness and in bed. There's a scene where
Yeah,
like they're just in the shanty and they hear the sounds, and we're going to get to this, the sounds of like the indigenous population that's nearby,
yeah,
and they play an important kind of background role, which we're going to get to. But there's a late scene where Christina is really struggling in missing Sweden, and she's talking about like, don't you ever miss the old ones? And it makes you realize there's no elderly to lean on to get
it's
advice
true.
from. There's no parental figures. There's some neighbors. They have like his Christina's uncle is there, Danjel, who we comes up a couple times, and they're helpful, but it's not the same. Like, you don't have your family, you don't have an older population to lean on for memory as well, and so
It's a
he
really good point. I didn't think
yeah,
about
and
that.
and he realizes the moment, and this is one of the things that's so interesting about the Carl Oscar character is, in Christina, and they're contrasting, like, Carl's like always looking to the future and the next house that he's going to build.
Yeah.
And she's kind of like stuck, you know, remembering the past and wishing to return to things of the past. And some of it's for good reason, because there's a loss of heritage that comes with an immigrant transition that's presented pretty simply in this film. That's pretty interesting. Um, but he does this thing with her where he's doesn't want to lose her because he needs her, and that's a big part of this, is the partnership that's spoken of. And he basically says to her in bed, she's bemoaning losing the past, it's like, if you're battling with something, let me help. And this is the line, that's what good friends are there for. And that's the idea, is their partnership is as much a friendship as it is. It's rarely presented as a romantic relationship. I mean, there's glimpses of it, but for the most part, it's non-existent.
Or even that romantic relationship becomes a form of identity and lack later on in the film
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
because of all sorts of, like, that's linked with not, oh, you make me feel so good, but like, if we're not producing kids, what value do we have? And
Mm-hmm.
I think there's that real balance. There's that scene early on, and we got to be careful because I'll just talk randomly about this film. I may have
Yeah,
seen it
me too.
because
No,
I
I know
just
what you
think,
mean.
but there's that scene where all of the Swedish folks who have emigrated are in together in their house, which they've finally gotten built.
Yeah, the house, or the first house. Yes, this is.
Uh, it's a great scene, right?
And what's so interesting is, like, even there's the housewarming, which you should talk about. What's so interesting is Oscar, the evening after the party, which you're going to talk about, is already talking about the next house, and the next house is what becomes what's the name of it? The Naya Dumavala, right?
Yeah.
Which they're going to name it after their ancestral home, effectively, the new Dumavala.
But it's so interesting to me to see a bunch of Swedish folks, framed in 1850, talking about, how many of someone raises the question, how many of you regret leaving?
Right.
And many of them, like, I don't regret leaving, particularly the one character,
Ulrika.
who's Ulrika, who's wonderful, who's
Yeah.
basically like, they treated me like shit. I didn't have a
Yeah.
sense of who I was. And she talks later on about how they treated women. And she's like, this is for me, I wouldn't move back. And then Carl Oscar is like, I should have came here 6 years ago. Like,
Mm-hmm.
they were so all like, in. And there's some other great conversation around one of the characters who we see later on, who's talking about, who has a romantic or has a relationship with a Native American woman. And he comes back later on in a very interesting scene, where he seems to have come over the line or actually seen a point of view that no one in the film is really willing to take on, especially when it comes to the Native Americans. But anyway, the whole piece, as they're talking about this and as we're hearing this, is Christina breaks down.
Yeah.
And Christina's like, I do have deep regrets. And I love Christina because she is this character who is trying to communicate, like, the ambivalence around being in the new world. And it was
Yeah.
all like, oh, this is great. I'm doing this. I'm a Texican, to quote from the searchers. And what we need to do is
Right.
put ourselves in the ground to allow the next, generation to grow up. Like, she has deep questions around why she's there and if she's even happy.
Yeah, and it's presented in a number of different ways in her kind of struggle, which is in stark contrast to Carl Oscar. And I think it's their relationship in this contrast. It's one of those I was talking about. It's like she lives in the old world and he always is living in a future world. And they're like, there's a bridge. Their relationship is the bridge between.
Yeah.
And she is this. She's also, we learn of her religiosity through, there's a priest that kind of shows up in the middle of the night, unexpectedly, and they don't, or he's just a stranger, and it's great. She's like, ask who it is before you open the door, Carl Oscar.
It's true. It could be anyone,
And it's this stranger, and he turns out to be a minister, and she's enthralled with
Yeah.
the idea of, oh, it's someone from the old land, someone who's important, someone with stature, because
Yeah.
he's, if you're, if you're a minister, that means you've studied, you have, you know, the whatever the scripture in you. And she says, please, read some scripture, say some scripture for us, and this comes on. And when he ends up hosting one of the first services in their house, the Nilsons host it, and that's their last name, that's Christina and Carl Oscars, they're the Nielsen family.
Yeah.
And it's one of the funniest scenes in the film. It's like she's really interested and invested in this service, but suddenly one of her sons is just standing at the doorway because it's their house, and he's like crying and crying, and she's trying to ignore it. And she gets up and
And
goes
the
to her.
minister stops, won't go on. Everyone is looking at her. Like, it's not like today where people would just ignore it, or at least in the US, people ignore, oh, it does not happen. Everyone stops, looks at her.
Yeah, and she goes out, and he's got like basically the equivalent of a modern poopy diaper, but there's no there's no diapers. And she proceeds to grab some grass and wipe his butt, and then wipes her own hands with the grass and comes back in, and then it continues. And she's just like, as you've described, she's this remarkable portrait of a woman. Like it's not something films do enough, is to flesh a character out this way, especially in a Western, and especially one set in America, for God's sake, too.
Absolutely.
You
Yeah.
know?
I think one of the best performances I've ever seen. And
Yeah.
she is just like striking in how much she embodies this. And one of the interesting things about this is, as they traveled and filmed this film, she took her 3-year-old daughter with her, who she
Mhm.
had, I think she got divorced, and then I think the child was out of wedlock, and it was a huge scandal. And the other piece is that she's Norwegian, and that she speaks Swedish, but they didn't think she spoke good enough Swedish
Right.
to actually do this film, because it is such an important book, as we talked about. So there was some kind of controversy around her doing this film, and obviously she was perfect for the role. I can't really speak to the accents, obviously, but
No, there's a
yeah,
conversation about the accents, and I'm like, oh wait, there's the idea of dialect, and I'm like, holy crap! Like,
yeah.
since we're English speakers, and yes, if they were doing like bad Boston accent or like Long Island accent, I bet you would love to like
But
imagine
it's
understanding that.
interesting too. I mean, there's a point there. Let's hold on, put a pin in that
Yeah.
language point, because it comes back later on, and I think it's super important, at least from my point of view, being an emigre for 10 years now. But one of the things that she says is her daughter was part of the filming. And
Mm.
so she was one of the characters. She was one of her kids, and she said it was really a wonderful experience because of the way that John Troll did the film. That it really was like she could be with her kid and do this, even though it was long days. But there was one scene, she said, where she had to act in the emigres, and her daughter was lost. And Carl Oscar finds her and brings her back, and they're on the boat. A scene I haven't seen, actually, but she was talking about it, and that's where did I see the right film? But she says she had to act and start crying and grab her kid and be really upset. And her kid had no idea why she was so upset, because she was like, "Oh, great, Max von Sydow is bringing me back to mommy," and mommy's freaking out. And Liv Ullmann makes the point that that was one of the times in the film where, her being an actress with her daughter as an actress too didn't work. And
Yeah.
the film really hurt, the reality of what their relationship was. And she talks about things we have alluded to again and again in this podcast about children and acting. And this seemed like European, like by all intents and purposes, much better than the American
Oh,
experience.
Jesus. Yeah.
But but it was
Kids.
interesting that she gets into that, and that her role as a mother was deeply. And she was 35 when she filmed this.
Right. Yeah.
I
And
can't
it,
believe that. She
and,
looks 17.
and she, they already you've already alluded to how, her motherhood is intrinsic to her identity. And she's we don't the kid count is hilariously never enumerated. No, not even like through exposition of a neighbor or her uncle or something like that. It's like, yeah, how many kids do you got, how many have died, where are you guys, what's your head count going like. And but there's it the idea of like what this film does clearly is like child rearing is physical sacrifice. Like her body is literally being wrecked because there's no hospitals, there's no drugs. There is one scene of labor, and Ulrika basically helps with it, and it just looks awful. Of course, I mean, it's in a dirty shanty, or maybe they were in their first house at this point when they have their first child born in America. um, that was created back in Sweden. Like, so
Yeah.
it's like made in Sweden, born in America. It's this moment, and it's ultimately her commitment to this role of producing children, which is kind of interesting because in some part we've talked so much about how her existence in America is something she is really, really struggling with, but at the same time she wishes to have this legacy through her kids. And but then she also fears their Swedish legacy as her children start to learn English. In the school book, like the child standing up and reading like a really crappy school book and a bunch of sentences like, I like apples, or we walk, she walks, it's just like, what the hell? Like, man, grammar books sucked even back in the 1850s.
I mean, and that was my point about the language piece is, as she starts to see them lose their language,
Yeah.
like she has even greater struggle. And I think Antonella dealt with that seriously when we were in Fredericksburg and the kids were starting to be of speaking age. And they spoke English, obviously, and their Italian was basically non existent. I think that's why we came back here, because language is so key to understanding culture. And
Absolutely.
I think that ending scene, to jump ahead to that final picture, the point they make, which is so important, is there are Swedish kids, but are they? They don't
Yeah.
speak Swedish,
No,
right?
it's the
Like
it's the
they're
assimilation.
kind of not like that language piece is the bridge that would help them understand. And I
Mhm.
think that's why our kids now take it for granted. I speak English and Italian fluently, and that's fine. But like that was part of our emigration story, was to make sure that language was not lost in that acculturation. And it's an interesting piece to it, because once you lose the language, I think you lose almost everything. Not everything, but almost everything.
Yeah, and there's a documentary that was about one of the Operation Baby Lift babies. So at the end of the Vietnam War, as the Viet Cong are taking over, um, and they're literally, the Southern Vietnamese that were collaborators and supporters of the Americans. They knew there was chance there were many were going to be slaughtered, and so there was this moment where there were Vietnamese parents giving up their children to be
Yeah.
taken on a helicopter, and as many as they could, and brought to America. And this documentary is about her trying to return to Vietnam, and discovering her birth parents. And frankly, the entire thing is like incredibly awkward, as you suggest, because she has no access to the culture, because she has no access to the language.
Yeah. And it really has helped me, I mean, form a sense that, and now I speak like really bad Italian, but enough to like start a conversation. But like without that access, even in a place where they say, yeah, we speak English or whatever, without that access, you really are an outsider.
Yeah.
And like that's interesting. Whereas my kids kind of found themselves in that role through elementary school to become an insider. And even then they're like, you kind of have an accent. Are you an
Yeah.
outsider? But like that's super interesting. And when I lived in America, I really never thought that. Like English was the bubble within which I existed. And now living outside of that, um, I realized personally just language rules all when it comes to identity and kind of understanding yourself in a cultural frame. And that's why I think this film for me is so powerful, is because when Max von Sydow tries to deal with the Americans in his way, you see how powerless he is in this infrastructure, but yet how much he wants to be a part of it. You know, he's becoming a citizen. He wants to go to
Yeah.
war. He's
Yeah.
like, he wants to be part of it, but there is that thing. It's like his kids may be part of it, or their kids may be part of it, but not him.
Yeah. Yeah. There's there's a great podcast I was listening to with some New Yorker, and he was telling me about, it's like the the person who was talking to, so this guy was born in New York, and this journalist was saying, well, I've lived in New York for 30 years. And it's like, I'm in New York. And he's like, no, you're not. And he's like, but I've been here 30 years. It's like, you're not. And it's like, well, my kids are born in New York. It's like, well, you did right by your kids, because at least they're New Yorkers. And so I get to say that too. It's like, my kids are born in New York, so at least they're New Yorkers, because I'll never be
Yeah.
one ultimately from this perspective. And but to kind of turn on a different note, one of the things we haven't even brought up yet is the really incredible story within this story of the relationship between Carl Oscar and his much younger brother Robert. And Robert arrives, and when he arrives in the new land, he's only 18. And again, this is through Wikipedia reading, because I have in one of the documentary with Kohler. Why am I bringing? What's the director's?
His name is Jean Troel. I want to say
Troll.
Troel because if I
Yeah.
say Troll, I feel bad.
And there's this. He apparently was a dreamer, as presented in the first
Yeah,
film,
that's what
and
Christina says, right?
part of his experience of coming to America is that kind of mythic fantasy of like endless possibility in America. And in his case, he and his friend Arvid, who's also come over, dream of finding gold in the great gold rush of the
Yeah,
latter end of the 19th century. And he tells Carl Oscar, like, this is his plan, and Carl Oscar tries to forbid it. Right? He's the much older brother. He wants to protect his brother like he would a son, because he knows he's prone to fantasy, if you will. And their journey, as presented through flashbacks, is probably one of the most striking parts of the film, because almost the entire sequence, and it does similar to like the Searchers, where they're when the Searchers are going through enormous amounts of time, and they bounce back between the hearth of I can't remember the name of the family, and then Ethan and the younger man are out searching
the
for.
Bjornsons, right? So
Yeah.
they're actually Swedish, the Bjornsons.
Yeah. And so in this situation, he's come home very much later. So he and Arvid take off one spring morning, basically. And it's many, 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 many minutes, scenes, years later, he returns, because this film is like, time is really impossible to track. It just
No,
happens.
it's a hard one to talk about in that way
Yeah.
because it just like it's like daily routine. It's quotidian. There was a
Hmm.
film called Bob Le Flambeur that I think that was the one. I don't know if that was the one, but it was a film with Jean Gabon. It was one of his films, and used to I taught it in a hard boiled class, but I called it home boiled because it's home boiled because you would see John Gabon brushing his teeth and in his bathrobe and like shuffling around in his slippers. And I'm like, what kind of fucking film noir shows the main guy brushing his teeth and putting on his bathrobe? And I got such a kick out of that. And it's that European take on it. And
Yeah.
this is very much like a domestic Western, right?
Yeah.
It's a very quotidian Western in ways that are just kind of impossible to imagine in the American genre
Right. And so
or the
it's
American version of the genre.
And so when Robert returns, he's visibly unhealthy, right? His teeth are a mess. He's
Yeah.
coughing a ton, and he's really cagey about what happened. And he's without Arvid, and he says he has stayed behind. And and they immediately, it's sad because Carl Oscar, as part of trying to be a father, trying to control a dreamer of a child that you worry for their safety, understandably so, starts to, kind of browbeat him, and it's like, this is what a waste, what a terrible waste. You're such a liar. You think you've been successful, but then out of nowhere, he produces this massive wad of cash. And it's like, look, I found the gold. Look at all this money I've made. I'll never have to. And I love this phrase. It's like, we'll never have a landlord again, right? This idea of
Yeah.
financial independence even exists in this context, that one that like persists to this day, the idea of landlords and home ownership,
That is one of the real things, is that financial kind of yoke we all suffer
Mm,
under, whether it's in 2025 or 1850, right?
yeah, yeah. And so at first they're stunned, both Christina and Carl Oscar, and they're like, whoa. But then they do this dance of bouncing back and forth through flashbacks of what Robert and Arvid endured, and then the present, and him like reconcile. And what, Trollo talked about is like, these chapters in the books were titled Robert's Dreams, and it
Uh,
is very dreamlike because the way it's presented is there's almost no dialogue. And there's
no,
even very little natural sound. There's this percussive soundtrack, music that happens, that he talked about. The director talked about as being the result of, he had a good friend who was a jazz drummer, and he showed him these scenes of them wandering in the desert, Arvin and Robert, and basically dying of thirst. And he was just had this habit of rat-a-tat-tatting on surfaces, and this is he's probably hearing at the same time the click clack of a film,
yeah.
and that's what inspired the soundtrack of what we were presented with. And his friend actually performed it on a variety of percussive instruments. But it's just so sad and haunting, because we eventually realize that the money, the cash, is bad money. It's quote unquote wildcat money. Do you know what wildcat money is? Did you happen to look that up?
I didn't look up Wildcat money, but I have a story about counterfeit that I'll talk about after you talk about
Okay,
that.
so it's not counterfeit money. It's just bad securities. It's like collateralized debt, securities, that, tanks an entire economy. This is
So it's
similarly kind of,
Bitcoin
yeah.
or no, crypto.
It's securities. Like, it's basically these kind of wildcat banks of the Midwest, because there is no federal banking system yet. That no, there's a federal banking system, but there is no federal currency yet that is universal. And so states could create their own currencies. And of course, there's a lot of shenanigans that go on. And so this
Absolutely.
was a real currency that they created by an Indiana bank. And poor Carl, Robert discovers through Carl Oscar going to the bank with this currency and saying it's worthless, because there's nothing behind it anymore. The bank that existed is gone, and
Yeah.
whatever resources that went with the issuing of those bills, was long ago absconded with.
See, that's super interesting too, because one of the things I thought about when that came up is, to your point about all these states having their own kind of, even earlier, like in the colonial period into the revolution, each
Mhm.
state would have their own coins. And so a huge crime. So I have this kind of book of early American crime narratives. And a huge part of those crime narratives are actually about counterfeiting coins and
Yeah.
finding the people who are counterfeiting the coins. But I think the larger point of this, and it's an interesting story, and Herman Melville wrote a novel about it called The Confidence Man, and where he kind of lost faith in America and the fact that it's just a whole bunch of scammers and shammers. And you kind of see that a little bit with Robert's dreaming. And then all of these people, even in that short period, who are out to get him. And then on top of that, add the fact that neither of them understand the language. And you just realize how impossible it is for them to come out ahead, in this new world that is also premised. Even the one dude who's with them, and I don't know if he's supposed to be Mexican or
Oh,
supposed to,
their guide. Yeah.
yeah. Think about him, and like I saw him in one of the shots coming through the desert. And I was like, how fucking crazy must have those 19th century, you
Yeah.
know, people been out on the edge of nowhere
Mhm.
going, to find their fortune? Like, they must have been absolutely psycho. It reminds me again of that book by Cormac McCarthy, Blood Meridian. But like, there's this sense of just a character and a mentality that we probably in the 21st century can't even imagine, right?
No, I mean, yeah, it's an you're describing basically like, so, Robert and Arvid are presented through, happenstance of travels, all this enduring of suffering. Like, first they're like on a steamship and they're peeling potatoes and witnessing a slave owner beat a slave, and then they're working on a farm, chopping wood before they're on their next trip. And eventually they make it, as you describe. They seem to be finally on their way to California, and they have a bunch of donkeys, and they have a guide who's going to lead them across the desert. And the whole story is, in the middle of the night, a donkey gets loose, and so they go to try to gather the donkey, and they get lost. And it's through just sheer bad luck, and that's what so much of this life is about. It's like one small bad turn, and you end up dead. And as they're like lost in the desert, and they're succumbing to the lack of water, and they're wandering around and around practically in circles, and the editing is getting weirder and weirder. It's really experimental film
It
stuff,
is.
actually.
It's
Yeah.
like Easy Rider stuff meets, the European film. It was interesting in that regard.
Yeah, yeah. And it's just, and you're, as you're describing, there's all this evidence of failure out there. Like, you see the carcass of a horse, you see the remains of a burned and broken, carriage that was probably of settlers trying to make their way across the desert to California or wherever their goal was. And that's what you're describing. It's like endless pain of an existence here. And, sadly, Arvid, so overcome by thirst, ends up drinking poisonous water, and he dies. And then luckily the guide, and this is just a simple recap, just sort of, the guide finds Robert and then takes him to a town, and then the guide ends up with yellow fever, and in Robert trying to nurse him to health and risking getting yellow fever himself, entrusts him and gives him his fortune, which is a bag of coins, which is actually of value,
It is a fortune, yeah.
but sadly Robert gets duped in trading it for wildcat currency. And so
Yeah.
he never gets to the gold, even though he tells this haunting story of being in a town where
Oh my
a
God, yeah.
boy is suddenly dies from indigestion, and then it's from this, like, quickie autopsy, they discover all these gold nuggets in his belly, where because he had been stealing gold and swallowing it, hoping to pass it and collect it later on. And it's just nuts.
Yeah, it is nuts. I mean, his story is bizarre in many ways, but that wildcat currency and that whole link to this, another piece of this, we talk about the domestic, but a lot of the other westerns don't deal with financial in the same way. It's usually like the railroad's coming and they're going to take your land whether you
Yeah.
like it or not. But this
Right.
one is like they're doing books, they're
Right.
deciding
You're
how many
right.
oxen they need. Like, there is this really relatable budget, right, and
Yeah.
reality in which you
Yeah.
have to
Yeah.
live in to make it. And
Yeah.
that's one of the things that really drew me to this movie
Yeah.
is
And
it was the West as if it
mm.
lived.
Yeah, it's not a contrast like you're like you were describing most westerns. It's more of a class kind of conversation, like wealthy landowners versus, those trying to make ends meet, on the land, and wealthy landowners trying to steal it from them, or push them out of their land that they've claimed. And you're right. It's like, over, even though it's in Swedish writing, we can't read it, but you see the numbers, you see the text. And
Yeah.
for me, that, like, you've already spoken of it, but that letter, like the postage due for the letter from his, I believe it must have been his sister from home. And it's so sad, because at first he can't afford it. It
Yeah.
exists. It's in the shop owner's, the general store owner's hands. And he's like, come back with the money and I'll give it to you. And he has to walk away. He literally has to, persevere without having access to this thing that's probably worth more than gold to him, is like word from home, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, that actually, I don't know where we want to go with this because there's so much to talk about. But there's one of the things that makes me, because this movie, and it's to your point that you made early on, which is such a great point. This perspective, this European perspective on early America, and or at least the 19th century. I don't think whether this is early America or not, it's kind of not. It's we're getting ready for the Civil War. It's kind of that shift to the more modern period in America. But that's also a period when you have these kind of like our period now, when you have these great fluctuations of wealth and of value, the gold rush being just one, right? But then there's also this entire enclosure of the Native Americans pushing them out of their lands.
Yeah.
And this film deals with that really, really powerfully. Like, it is not the Native Americans running around on horses shooting back, and then you get a sense, and it's warrior versus warrior, right? This is folks who have basically been entirely marginalized by an entire culture or cultures at this point. And, they're essentially, if our family, is fighting for survival, right? What do we say that the Native Americans are fighting for? Like, they're not even subsistence, right? They have been pushed to the point of, it's kill or die,
Yeah.
and it's crazy.
Yeah, they're presented in this really interesting way. Is they're kind of bookends to the movie. They're introduced, as I've already described, like we hear them in the distance from the shanty at night, and we see them just kind of traveling patiently across the frozen lake or paddling a canoe earlier in the spring. And they're in this they're there and they're on their own frontier family
Yeah,
film,
they
and
are truly actually.
because they're not enemies, they're not warriors, they're just families trying to persist in a really, really harsh environment. And there's another scene where, there are these women, indigenous women that kind of walk up to the Nilsson homestead, and Christina's there, and she goes in and grabs like a piece of cooked meat, or no, a piece of meat to be cooked, and gives it to them, and they walk away. And so they exist, and they're really struggling, and it's what's important is like Carl Oscar's perspective on them. He's somewhat indifferent because there's this really interesting conversation towards the end of the film, which is the preceding bookend to the kind of presentation of the Dakota War of 1862, which is crazy to know about, because that's like basically going on while the Civil War is going on at the same
Yeah,
time,
exactly.
and so he comes across Dangel, his wife's uncle, in the woods, and he looks like a trapper in this scene. It's kind of great. Dangel is like super weathered, and he's got sun burned lips in the wintertime, sunburned lips, and he's really being reflective and talking about how we've stolen this land because they've come across a frozen, a dead Indian, and Native American. And he's saying, like, and Carl Oscar takes real offense at this. Is like, I didn't steal anything. I paid for this, to the government. It's like, but you're not really thinking about it, Carl Oscar. Yes, you bought it. It was very, 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 very cheap, number one. And where did they get it from? Where did
Yeah.
that land come from?
And it was a really powerful conversation. And the
Yeah.
whole idea is this Native American that had been frozen. And it's like the second frozen Native American we saw. The other one, because they can't bury them because it's the ground is too cold. So they put them in a tree.
Yeah.
But this one was on the ground. And there was evidence, and I don't know if it was this, but the trapper says in general of the Native Americans being so hungry that they had to eat their own children.
Right.
And that was like that was a situation where he wasn't saying, "Oh, those savages," and
No.
then they would come. He
No.
was saying, like, this is what they've been reduced to,
Right.
by this movement west, and it continues. And I think it finally comes to a culmination towards the end of the movie. And you don't really have it, like you said, they were just coexisting in a parallel universe.
Hmm.
But as history happens, that universe comes to a head with the settlers in this part of Minnesota. And I think it was the Dakotas, right? As you said, kind
Yep.
of they are done. They've been kind of removed from their lands, and now they're fighting back. And
Yeah.
probably too little, too late. But what they do is, equally as brutal.
Yeah, I looked it up. I mean, this is again Wikipedia reading, but half-assed internet research, as they say on the Rewatchables podcast, which is a film podcast that I love. Um, this is born out of bad deal making and bad faith deal making, basically, where the Dakota Nation sold, or the Sioux Nation, the Dakota Warriors, I think, are part of the Sioux Nation, are sell their land for pennies on the dollar, and in return they're going to receive goods and services from traders, and it's shifty traders that deny them access to all this food and supplies that they were promised, and that's really what brings it to a boil, is
Yeah.
that the deal has gone bad, and so they feel they're justified in attacking. And it's the homesteaders of Minnesota that bear the brunt of this bad faith trade that had happened on behalf of the federal government, and not poorly enacted. And it's, from what I was reading, it's really extra tragic because the federal government under Lincoln was about to intervene and rectify the situation, but it was too late. And
Yeah.
so what happens, as you describe, is they hundreds of warriors start just like ravaging the land, and we see this really visceral scene. And it turns out to be Dangel's homestead and his children, and his brothers, or brother and husband of one of his daughters. And it ends with like the daughter being slaughtered and her unborn child being pulled and planted on a stake in front of their house. And
Yeah.
that's it's that's the closest we get to real violent West. But the ultimate violent act is he decides to present the execution of the 38 Sioux warriors, because there was some 300 sentenced by in the aftermath of this war, when Lincoln sends in the cavalry, literally, and they of course overtake and take prisoner many Native Americans. And Lincoln decides to what is it, to not allow the
Pardon.
execution, to
Yeah, he
pardon.
pardons a good like 200 and change, right?
Yeah, 260 something, but 38 are executed simultaneously. And this is presented in the film, apparently very historically accurate. Like the gallows that they create, places that Troll created, allows, what they did is every single one of the Indians were you know encased in a head covering, and then has a noose put around the neck, and they literally drop the floor of all 38 Native Americans simultaneously. And
It's a
it's
it's
so
a rough scene.
it's so tragic, yeah, and it's just so awful. And because their frontier family experience ends in catastrophe, because of the what has happened with these white families from Sweden, or in bad deal making, take over.
Yeah,
And
it's one
it's
of the few movies I've seen in the Western that deals with it that deeply,
yeah.
right? Like that takes it to that level. I mean, I think there are some obviously more revisionist ones, but this one in the 70s going down that road, and they're all in the same gallery, like
Mhm.
you said, and they're perimeter, and the camera just stays on them as they're swinging, right?
Yeah.
And it stays extra long, and
Yeah.
it's obviously being reflective about what's this going on. And it only took a quick conversation to kind of sum up the shit deal that the Native Americans got for the last
Yeah.
200 and change years, right? Like it's again, it's that outside point of view that I think really um, makes the Western piece of this and the history piece of this so powerful.
Yeah. And so at the same time, while this attack on the community is happening, and you have the community kind of mobilizing, and we see like families barricading around the church in town, and and neighbors come to Carl Oscar and ask him, like, what are you going to do? And he's like, I can't leave. Christina's ill. She's bedridden. And I think they take the children at least, and he stays with Christina. And this is where we learn, we haven't spoken of this yet, but at a certain point, she's had so many children, and she's getting sick. She goes into town, and Ulrika is like this awesome host. Like Ulrika's married a Baptist minister, right? And she gets rejected by these assholes that we've already talked about. How like Christina and Carl Oskos kind of stomp on. It's like, she's our friend. Back off. Don't
Yeah.
try to be guardians to us. We're fine with what she's done, and she's this wonderful host. And there's these scenes between Ulrika and Christina that are so great in town. And there's this one night where Christina actually gets to sleep in a real bed in a nightgown, and it's
Yeah.
so wonderful.
She's got the cap on and she's
Yeah.
all happy, snug in a rug, right?
Yeah. But in contrast to this moment, she's in town to visit the doctor, and we learn through Ulrika that because Christina can't even say it to Karl Oskar, that the next child that she has will be her death, right? It will be her undoing, because her body is so ravaged from the many children she's born, and she can't take it. And in a certain scene earlier, before the attack by the Dakotas, she's like, she goes to Oscar and is like, it's all good. Let's be together again. Like, I need this. I need you.
Yeah.
And he relents, and he doesn't want to, because he's the practical one. He like says, like, your life is what's important. Your surviving is what's important. She's like, my life is meaningless. Like, I'm useless. I'm not a wife anymore unless I can do this.
Yeah. That's a hard scene, because then she also says it's in God's hands now.
Yeah.
And I think that's another piece of this film. It covers everything. It covers the history of the Native Americans, covers obviously the coming to America, covers the sham deals, and then it covers really, I think, eloquently the role of religion in all this.
Yeah.
And like it's clear that part of why many of these Swedish folks came to America was not only financial, although that was probably the biggest reason, but was also for religious freedoms. And that's an ongoing kind of narrative in those coming over to the U.S. from the beginning, or to the to what would be called North America, I guess. And I think this is so interesting to me, because as soon as they get neighbors, as soon as people start moving in the neighborhood, the religious kind of nuts come out of the woodwork, and like they start putting the pressure on them, like, you're not good religion, you got to build a church first. Oh,
Yeah.
your friend is doing this, she's not to be trusted. Oh,
Yeah.
wait, you are associating with them, you're a bad Christian. And like, you start seeing the kind of everything they were trying to escape starting to reestablish in the
Yeah.
new world. And I think Karl Oskar and Christina do a really good job of kind of pushing back on that and remaining intact. But you can see like the narrative of religion, and just how much also that defined the West at this time.
Yeah.
Kind of, you talked about it with the preacher, the whole idea of building a church. That's when it's finally a town. That's a real another thread throughout this whole movie. And, Karl Oskar, you can get a sense from the beginning when the guy starts talking to him, his neighbor, like, he's like, oh shit, religion? Really? I just want to build my big barn.
Oh, wait, this is a good side story. So this is really random, but kind of funny, because I had basically that oh shit moment in my first day of college. I went to, oddly, a Catholic college. I mean, even though I'm not Catholic, I was like one of like 50, I feel like, out of 3,000 people that wasn't Catholic at Holy Cross. But as part of the punishment for not being Catholic, my two roommates, one of them was we'll just talk about one. Was the punishment was he was a born again Christian, and I was like oh shit.
My God.
And he was a wonderful guy. I loved him, and we used to play hearts with one of my really good friends, Mike McGee, and Bill Schofield would play hearts with us, because we liked, it was a way like we could just play games and be competitive and enjoy each other's company. And Hearts allows you have to count cards to do it, play it well. And Mike McGee would constantly be just like, Jesus fucking Christ, Jesus. And Bill Schofield would always be like, Mike, can you just please not take the Lord's name in vain? His religiosity would come out, and it was always such a trip. And you're right, like you're just not ready for that kind of religiosity in your life so intimately, and you just have to find your way navigating through it. And it's, Carl, Oscar, and Christina do navigate it well, and it's, they don't completely hold it against them too. It's not a film that's about that. Like it's not about,
No,
there's no dramatic arcs built around that.
no.
And that's the thing about this film in general. It's like Robert just dies, right? Like, he comes back and he's very sickly, and he ends up, after learning the money's bad, and days later, months later, we don't know, he's wandering the woods, and it's almost like he's wandering the desert, but it's beautiful. And he finds this stream, and he gets a wonderful drink of water, and then he just dies. And Carl Oscars makes his gravestone. And these are the things that happen. It's like, oh, our neighbor's an asshole and trying to tell us how to live our lives. But then many, many years later, during the attack on the community, he's like saying, hey, I'll take your kids. Like there is, it's not
point.
built around this, like, oh, that's going to be a dramatic arc, the way this neighbor is interfering in their lives. No, it's just a moment, and then they move on. And that's
It's
so much
not
of
an
what this
us
is
and
around.
them until it's Native Americans. And that's so interesting because that also
Yeah.
underlines the history of,
Yeah.
the
Right.
US,
Yeah.
or North America in general. Like it's not us and them until it is.
Right.
And
And
that would be
Petrus.
true of the slaves too, as they kind of tried
Yeah.
to allude to very
Yeah.
briefly. Like
Yeah.
there is a moment where it's not all about the community and we can forget it. Like
Yeah.
there are lines in the sand.
Yeah.
And, this movie does a good job of poking at that in
Yeah. Yeah.
several moments.
Petrus, who's that religious neighbor, he in this moment where he's gathering his kids for him while he has to attend to Christina's bedroom, says, like, he's so indignant, and he says, the white men give the red man the gospel, and the red man repays it with a war axe. But the other neighbor who's right next to him is like, well, perhaps they would rather have had bread than sermons.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
You
And
know?
yeah, and there is that sensibility where at least people are talking. It's not like Ethan from The Searchers, right? Like who's
Yeah.
it's all or nothing. Although Ethan from The Searchers is an interesting dude too because he speaks their language, he has
Yep.
access to their culture, but yet he's still an ornery bastard and he won't take anything from anyone. But like obviously it's almost you can't even talk about these films, Shane and Searchers and The New Land, in the same breath. Like
No.
they're just different beasts entirely.
Yeah.
And to your point, we're starting to get into, and we'll see more of these revisionist Westerns that
Yeah.
are really doing, they're taking the myths that we've been kind of, coddled with in the 50s and 60s and or even early 60s, because by the end of the 60s and into the 70s and so on, all of those myths of the Western start to get, interrogated.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's one of the reasons why the Western as a genre keeps on giving, if you will, is
Oh,
because as we start to interrogate our own past, our own assumptions, right? It seems like the Western is always right there for us to make a movie to look at
yeah.
some of that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm completely different podcast. I'd say let's just do Westerns. It's always been one of my favorite genres. And one of my simplest examples why is the entire films just exist outdoors. And I loved the outdoors, and I just loved, it was always this contrast of pastoral and punishing, the outdoors.
Yeah.
And I loved that. I loved camping, and that it drew me into that idea, this mythic idea of existing in the land, and persisting off of it. And so the way this film is, we're already kind of keep trying to get towards the end of it, but you keep drawing in more topics
It's
like religion.
impossible.
But so, Carl Oscar is stuck in the middle of this kind of war, having to tend to his wife, who I've described as like had to go to the doctor. She's learned that she can't have children, but she persists and kind of compels Carl Oscar to get her pregnant again. And she gets pregnant, but she loses the child. And effectively her body's failing now. And she's only, because I remember this, she's only like 42 or something like that. She's incredibly young still. Or no, I think she was like 38. incredibly young. And there's this a really extended scene or scenes of Carl Oscar just tending her by the to her by the
Yeah,
bedside. It must last like 15, 20 minutes. It's kind of wild,
yeah,
right? And it's the first time we hear a clock in the background, right? And there have been these like modern conveniences showing up, even though the labor still continues. Like I mentioned, a sewing machine. There's like a cooking stove and a wood stove, so they're no longer obviously on open fires. But now we're hearing a clock, and time is suddenly present for the first time ever in the entire film, where we've talked again and again of like, what year is it? What season is it? Because they just drift through them so quickly. And now suddenly the clock is ticking, and it's ticking literally for Christina. And there's this moment where he goes outdoors and grabs an apple from their glass tree, a tree that it's a native tree to Sweden that Carl Oscars had shipped from to them from Sweden to Minnesota. And he speaks of like it's finally producing for the first time, and he's like giving it. It's like, look, it's our first apple. It's ripe. Smell it. And she's like, oh, I smell. And this is like literally she ends in her death is like, I'm home, because she smells the apple. She takes a bite of the apple, and she literally says, "Oh, there's this wonderful poetic line where she wakes and she says, I was dreaming that I was winging in the ox raids," and it's just like, wow. And it's
yeah,
just this beautiful, simple ending of her life. Not a simple ending because the movie's not over. Of she's like, oh, thank God I'm home. You know?
yeah. Or and whether she's imagining herself back in Sweden or imagines herself home and this is the
Yeah,
fruit of all of her labor,
yeah,
right? Literally, that labor comes up again. It's not clear, and that's nice because I
yeah.
don't think she was ever clear about it till the end. I
No,
think she's the great existential crisis of this movie about what it would mean to emigrate and come to a new land and how it wouldn't be like, yes, it's for our kids. Everything's great. Yeah. I'm gonna join the war, like me. And she's like, what are you, an idiot? You're gonna
yeah.
willingly go to war and kill
Oh yeah,
people? Like she's like, she's so wonderful. And
yeah.
even just
She.
moments at which you look at her and she
Mhm.
like was the way she's looking at her kids, the way she's giving them a bath, the way
Oh,
she's
the cleaning
just
scene is so
living.
great.
Oh
Yeah,
my God. It's
yeah,
it's like about, I mean, it's so much about living, but then to your point that you just made about that final scene when she's dying is, you know, sadly, like you go through this experience with your kids and you have this kind of what seems like a forever, and then they start leaving. And
yeah,
then I've talked about this a lot on this podcast because obviously, that means something to me. But, even in your own life, you start feeling the time and the clock ticking. And like, what has it been about? Or where are you going? And you have like your family, whether it's the family you came from, the family you've created, and the family they might go to, becomes the only kind of consistent thread, or the families we make, right? Which are of friends. Like it becomes such an ongoing, and this film for me was like all encompassing in that way. I
yeah,
can't wait to watch the first 3 hours and really, like, seriously, like, really,
yeah,
because it is such a wonderful kind of epic brush of a family between continents, right? And what that meant in the 19th century, which I think is a super interesting period anyway. But put on top of that, these brilliant performances. She's just amazing. Liv Ullman now will live forever in the kind of like, this is one of those just great performances. And I love Max von Sydow. I was telling you before, like Ming the Merciless, Flash Gordon, any day. But like Liv Ullman, like was just, I was like, Max who? Liv
yeah,
Ullman is just eating the scenes every time. And I just, yeah, it was great.
yeah. And with Christina finally out of the picture, the film surrenders Carl
Yeah.
Oscar to time,
Yes.
and in this way where there's no longer labor to do. Like he's finally successful, but he's now alone. And that's this other part of the sadness of
Yeah.
this extended family and children leaving and making their own families and making their own lives and not having someone to be with. And he's, for the first time in the entire film, like reflective. And
Yeah.
we see him writing a letter back to his sister and, basically still mourning his wife. And he puts on this incredible suit and he's delivered to his wife's grave by like a person who must work for him. So he's no longer, and he's working the clock and he's working the watch and he's just tracing. There's this moment of him tracing a map of the area, like in kind of we imagine him
Yeah.
thinking like, oh, I did that to that place. I did that to that place. And he's in his rocking chair, which is obviously this like archetype of retirement, to relax finally and just rock. But he's alone. And the film ends just incredibly simply, where it's a letter from a neighbor who is writing to his sister, and it's read aloud as voiceover. And he's explaining, like, I'm writing this because your brother has died. But none of his children can write in Swedish, so I'm doing it for them. You know, and the farm is now dormant, and there's rusting machinery, and there's nothing of Sweden left ultimately now.
No, that for me is, it's like that poignant piece. And the
Yeah.
part he writes back home where he says once his wife had died, how can he believe in a God? Like, so there's also like, not only that, but he starts to go dark. And then
Mhm.
all the things they sacrificed and all the things they did. And then the fact that their kids don't even really know their heritage. And it opens up questions of like, oh yeah, we did it for you. And it was, indubitably a good thing. It was like, well, no, just like Christina has been struggling with the whole film, like there were real sacrifices and real kind of costs to this move, and I love that film doesn't refuses to just kind of close it cleanly, but holds the ambiguity of what it really probably meant for these people to come over and all the things they lost in addition to what they gained. It's cool. It's that accounting that the film seems, obsessed with at certain times. It's also like a moral and existential accounting, like I guess the Swedes do really well, if Ingmar Bergman is any indication. Like, so like this was, it's a masterpiece. I fucking loved it.
Yeah, me too. Well, that's another one, Jim Groom.